So today there are 3 subjects, and the first one is to look at the subject of Shrimat, Parmat and Manmat. The second is to look at the forces of destruction and the forces of unity, because these are 2 opposing forces that we are in the midst of. And the third is to look at devotional practices that are still there among the BK family. So let us begin with Shrimat, Parmat and Manmat. So on the simplest level of all, Shrimat means the instructions of God, Parmat means other people's instructions, and Manmat is your own instructions. Sometimes in our translations we hear the word dictates, so the dictates of God, the dictates of others, the dictates of yourself. And there are other interpretations that I would like to bring in. As you know, I spent a lot of time with Dadi Janki and sat at her feet listening to her giving us the deep, in many ways hidden significance of Gyan. And there was an occasion where she talked a lot about Shrimat, Parmat and Manmat. And on that occasion she said that Manmat and Parmat is pretty much identical. And that's an unusual statement to hear in the Brahma Kumaris. So we queried this, and let us look at it in depth. What you can say for the word mat is that it can be termed ideology. And it can also be termed angle of perception, and the way that you look at the world, the inner world and the outer world, and what you think is true. So for example, a different sect or religion would be called as a mat because they have certain tenets, certain articles of faith that the adherents believe. And so we're going to take this word mat in that respect. So Shrimat, in that sense, is the pure, the true, the actual and the elevated angle on reality from the perspective of God. And I sometimes speak about 4 things which are Shrimat, making it very simple. So the first is be soul conscious. That means consider yourself to be a soul, which is a point of light, whose essential characteristics or qualities are purity, peace, power, love and bliss. So when you're soul conscious, you are aware of yourself as that. These are your characteristics. And a soul is genderless and cultureless, colorless, and uses the subtle instruments of the mind, the intellect and the sanskaras to perform the role, to interact in the external world with other souls, with matter. And we also use the mind and the intellect and the sanskaras in our interaction with God. So that is in opposition to Parmat and Manmat. And Parmat is that you are either a male or a female, you are a body, and you have a color and a gender and a culture and a religion, and this is your identity. So the first contrast is between whether you think of yourself as a soul or whether you think of yourself as a body. And when it comes to Manmat, Manmat is the internalized form of Parmat. So how does Manmat arise? From childhood, you hear Parmat from the external moral authorities, which are your parents, your teachers, and your religious leaders. And they instill these ideas into you, and that becomes your own. You absorb it until you consider that that is your opinion. In that way, Parmat and Manmat are the same, and Shrimat is totally opposed to it. The second Shrimat is remember God, or be God conscious, or connect yourself in yoga with God and draw power from that. And that means Srimat says that you have a right to and a capacity for a direct connection with God, and you have a right to and a capacity for directly absorbing power, light from God through your mind, and that this power takes the form of intensifying your amount and intensity of these 5 characteristics: purity, power, peace, love, and bliss. And also the other powers, the 8 powers that we know well, and many other powers, as well as all the virtues. These are absorbed directly from God through the combination of Gyan, Yoga, Dharana, and service. Now, in comparison with that, Parmat says something different. Parmat says it is impossible for you to have direct access to God, and that you must therefore have access to God via a religious authority or a prophet soul or a religious founder or a guru, but you cannot have direct access. Parmat also says that God is by definition unknowable, and therefore whatever you experience from God may or may not be true, but it is better if you believe what you are told by the religious authorities than your personal experience. Parmat also says that your conscience is not reliable, and that the moral authorities will provide you with a conscience, and they will tell you what is right and wrong, and if it doesn't correspond with your conscience, then you must give priority to the external moral authorities and not to your conscience. Whereas Shrimat is coming from God, who is addressing your soul, who tells you that you have an intellect, and your intellect is basically the same as your conscience. That is your capacity to know the difference between true and false and right and wrong. And he says that what he tells you and what your conscience tells you would be in harmony, would be the same, and that when you cultivate your intuitive powers, that also verifies the perception that you have through your conscience and your receiving of information from God, so that there is coherence and consistency between what God is telling you and what your conscience is telling you. The third Shrimat that God tells us is be pure. So be pure means pure food, So vegetarian and cooked in remembrance of God, offered, eaten in remembrance of God, prepared with love. Be pure means do your actions in soul consciousness according to your original qualities. Avoid acting on the basis of the five vices. Especially, Baba gives importance to celibacy, purity, sexual purity at every level, thought, word, action, response, behavior, all of this. And know that purity is essential in terms of you are fundamentally pure, you are not fundamentally impure. Paramat tends to tell you that you are fundamentally impure and that the external moral authorities will get you to be pure, whereas Shrimat tells you that you are fundamentally pure and that circumstances and people and incorrect ideas have corrupted you and robbed you of your purity. The big issue between Shrimat and Parmat in regard to purity is in terms of if you want to be married and remain celibate, then the society will tell you that you don't have that right, because your marital duty is to consummate the marriage by having sex and producing children, and that is included in purity. And the external moral authorities have to do this because otherwise there would be no more people. So they have to. In other words, what God is saying can only be said at the time of the end of the cycle, which is the time when we all have to leave the body and return back to the home. So the Murli that we listened to today was essentially that now we have to wind up everything and return back to the world of light, become free from all karmic bondages, become karmatit, and go. Parmat and Manmat cannot allow for that, because if we do that, then it's the end of civilization as we know it. And so there is this conflict between Parmat and Shrimat. I think it may be to do with a service, the fourth Shrimat, that is, whatever it is you have understood, embody that and communicate that to others verbally, vibrationally, in terms of example, and so on. What I also have concluded in studying these things is that Parmat corresponds exactly to what we also can define as morality. So morality and even ethics. If you look in the dictionary, the meaning of morality and ethics, so morality comes from the Latin, which means mores, and mores is the customs which have been devised by the elite, the leaders in any society, usually the males, and they decide what is right and wrong and how the society should be conducted, and it's given in a lot of details. In India, the detailed description of Parmat is actually contained in one of the scriptures, which is called the Manusmriti, and in English they call this the Laws of Manu. So this is called an eponymous scripture, and it was devised by many people but given the name Manu. And this is very common among the Indian scriptures, to compile in writing the ideas that are dominant in the society and kind of cast it in stone. So in the ancient times, people were figuring it out, we would say in the Copper Age or even in the Iron Age. Many of these things come from the beginning of the Iron Age. For example, the Dilvara temple was built at the beginning of the Iron Age. So the very, very ancient copper-aged memorials and ideas are actually hardly available. What we have access to is mostly coming from the Iron Age. So it hasn't been clarified exactly what is that dividing line between the Copper Age and the Iron Age, but one indicator is that what people generally think of as the ancient ideas are not that ancient, because they really were put into scripture form in the beginning of the Iron Age. So this is also reflected in the other scriptures of the other religions, and you find that it is quite biased towards the males and against the females. In many cases, it is said that the female has to defer to the decision of the male in any condition. And this was because they had the idea that anyway the males are educated, the females are not allowed to be educated because they don't need to be. The males run the politics and business and the military. Females are for the home, for rearing children, and for looking after all of the domestic and internal side of life, and that they have to pursue the different religious rituals and maintain that. So they make a very big division between the males and the females. So when you are a person who is following Shrimat, you find that there is a kind of paradox, because on the one hand, all our souls, all our brothers, and on the other hand, because of being in the context of society, if you would act in that way and make no distinction between males and females, like sitting on one side of the room or the other side of the room, and the different kinds of maryadas that are put in place, then the society would not at all accept the interaction with the BKs. And so it is necessary for us to function in multiple levels. So in terms of deeply understanding the self as a bodiless, genderless, colorless, cultureless being of light, this is essential. When it comes to interaction with Brahmins, there is an assumption that Brahmins are number wise, and that people are partially under the influence of Shrimat and partially under the influence of Parmat. So here we are in the confluence age, and we are moving gradually away from Manmat and Parmat and towards Shrimat. When you are a Brahmin and following Shrimat, it's a very good idea to try to write down, make 2 columns on a paper and write down what aspect of Shrimat is really deeply embedded into you, so that you are really on that level. Are you really genderless? Are you really colorless? Or do you still have an attribute of gender bias, color bias, race bias, culture bias in your feelings and attitudes and interaction with other people? Because there will be a percentage, and you need to try to evaluate what is the percentage and then work on reducing the percentage of that difference. When it comes to interacting in different social environments, you have to evaluate by your understanding and your intuition where people are in their mentality around you, and to what extent you can express the deep meaning of Shrimat in that context. And you have to be aware of yourself as an actor, be in your power, in the consciousness of Shrimat, interacting with people who believe deeply that Shrimat and Parmat is identical, whereas we know that it is the opposite. And we also know that there are many, many Brahmins who maybe unconsciously believe that Shrimat and Parmat are the same, because they haven't really analyzed it to a full extent. And here we wanted to start analyzing it. And when we talk about what are the devotional practices that are still there among BKs, this would be an area where there is some aspect of devotional which is mixed into the spiritual practices, because many of the teachers of Gyan are still in Parmat, thinking that it's Shrimat. So this is quite a subtle, quite a tricky aspect, and maybe we can go into it a little bit more later on. I'd like to take up, I think, some of these devotional practices now, because it follows on from the Shrimat, Parmat, Manmat. And the devotional practices are really to do with still feeling that conventional morality and values is the same thing as Shrimat, and that your values are universal. I did some work on values and spirituality, and in the process of that, it became very clear that it is not possible for there to be universal values, because values are based in culture and race and age and religion and class and education, and we can say that virtues are universal. And there are many people who think that virtues and values are the same thing, but my research has shown me that in a lot of cases they are the opposite, just as Shrimat and Parmat are opposite of each other, but a lot of people think that they are the same, so they have to be analyzed very deeply. You need to also, I think, spend a bit of time writing down what you think is the difference between a virtue and a value, because I think that there's probably a lot of confusion about this. And this is again because not everybody looks at definitions, not everybody makes a clear distinction between virtues, values, qualities, powers. They all get mixed together and we have a kind of soup with everything in it. And if we want to do our spiritual practice in the refined way and with the speed that Baba is asking us to do, then I think that it's worthwhile to do this kind of narrowing down of definitions. There are many BK practices that are based in people's desire to be acceptable and to gain approval. And so some BKs will do certain things which correspond to the requirements of politeness and decorum and morality and principles and ethics, which are embedded in the social class and community that you are part of, and that you will find ways to adjust gyan so that it fits in with the community that you want to communicate with and that you want to live with and interact with. And then there are many areas where it is fuzzy, what is the distinction? And I think it's inevitable, and there's nothing wrong with it. The reason why the question comes up is because there will be disagreements, because some BKs will find some ways of integrating with the community essential, and they will classify it as Shrimat, whereas others will say, no, that is not Shrimat. And this is because they really are not the same thing, but we do have to integrate them, and each one will integrate them differently, and it will be according to how they see fit, according to their capacity, according to their limitations. There are many attributes that will create a grey area, and you'll be in a kind of penumbra between the light and the dark. And I think that most people function in this penumbra, and we need to be aware of it, and we also need to decide for ourselves to what extent and under what circumstances we want to be in the penumbra. And the penumbra is like a graduated grey that goes between absolute light and absolute dark. And I think what we're trying to do gradually is to go closer and closer to the absolute light. And in order for us to do that, we really need to be so pure and so embedded in our spiritual consciousness that our power, our aura, our vibration dominates the social situation in which we find ourselves, and that the people accept us as we are because of the intensity and magnitude of your spiritual energy. And if your spiritual energy is less, you will not be able to do this, and consequently you'll have to go off into a darker grey area, and this is very individual. And so when we are trying to assess ourselves, we need to assess this aspect and understand where we're operating from, and then make the necessary efforts to go to a progressively lighter grey and ultimately entirely white place, which you can call as karmatit. Now I would just like to talk about the force of destruction, the forces of destruction, and the forces of unity. So we can say that the forces of destruction are the forces that try to pull us apart from each other and pull us apart from our own selves. One of the definitions of body consciousness is ego. And ego is called false ego. And so false ego means that we are in a kind of flip-flop between sometimes being very arrogant and sometimes being very lacking in self-assurance and self-confidence, sometimes thinking, I am wrong, I am weak, I am guilty, I can't make it, I'll never make it, I have to hide myself, And so this is all of body consciousness. The arrogant side is I know everything, I am the in charge, I am the representative, I am such and such, I am so and so, I am experienced, so you have to listen to me, you must accept my ideas, this type of thing. And so we flip-flop between the inferiority and the superiority of ego, and the ego position, or the body conscious position, is indicated by reactions to different kinds of problems, like your pain, your trauma, your confusion, to what extent you are dominated by other people's influences, to what extent you are afraid, to what extent you understand soul consciousness, to what extent you have faith in God. All of these will make a difference as to the extent to which you are stable in your stage of spirituality. And so there is this force of body consciousness, which is compounded by another force, a negative force, which I think we can call the force of evil. And Baba uses the term Ravan or Maya. And one description of it that I think you can consider is it is the overall accumulation of all negative karma performed by all souls from the Copper Age onwards, and it's an accumulated dark energy that you sometimes feel really strongly and sometimes not so strongly, but it is there, kind of drifting around, and sometimes you can feel it very intensely and sometimes you don't feel it at all. But there is such a thing. And whenever any Brahmin decides that they really want to seriously develop their spirituality, then it will act like a red flag and wave at this force of evil and say, come and take me out, because I otherwise will take you out. And this is also something we need to be prepared for. And I think a lot of BKs believe that if they are having very negative experiences, or they're unable to meditate, or they have difficulty in meditating, then it means there's something wrong with them, or they're not okay, or they don't know how to meditate, whatever. But actually, that is a thought process that comes from being under the influence of Parmat, which also encourages people to feel that they are guilty, they are wrong, and if anything's going wrong, it's their fault, and this sort of thing. But no, once you start to really do this, then you realize that part of your function is to be an instrument to negate, to melt, to make disappear this enormous dark force of evil, and so that your light has to be so bright that it makes that darkness disappear. And in India it is always said that darkness is a sign of the absence of light, and this is something to understand quite deeply, I think, because our main problem is that we do not have enough spiritual power. It doesn't matter how many bhattis and so on that you do, or how many hours you sit in meditation. What matters is the quality of your soul consciousness, the quality of your yoga, and are you really connected with Shiv Baba, or what is really going on when you're meditating. So this is something to look at. And are you really pulling in light and shining it? Because this requires good quality meditation, regular, and quite a lot. And it also requires a lot of solitude. And some BKs are very into doing all kinds of activities together to such an extent that there's no opportunity for solitude. And there is definitely a culture of service. And Daddy Janki used to say your efforts should be 95% for the self and 5% service. 95% meditation, 5% speaking knowledge. And she also used to say that 95% of BKs don't know how to meditate. And of course nobody liked hearing that, but it's very useful to think about it, because when you're assessing yourself, you want to ask yourself, am I really doing this the way it needs to be done, the way Shiv Baba wants us to do this? Or are we falling into the kind of the ways of religions, which is all about doing social service and doing things together and having picnics and all this kind of thing, which is very typical of religious communities. But another way that you can do this is to develop yourself more as a mystic, which means deep solitude, deep thought. Definitely do service, but not at the expense of your spiritual practice. And I think that now that we are in the lockdown and limitations and restrictions connected with the COVID-19, I think it is a gift from Baba to give us permission to really focus on the self and the yoga and developing that light, that brightness, and actually work on being a conduit so that the light of God can shine through our faces, through our eyes, through our aura, through our words. And as we absorb this to a huge extent, no one is going to feel that we are connected. And I think the greatest service is for people to look at us and see, this one is connected with God. Let me see further. If we just do talking and we're not connected, it will not have the sharpness of the sword that Baba very often talks about. The forces of unity are this, that when we are real and not trying to prove anything, when we are in our power and in our purity and integrity, and that this is the highest priority for us, then we come close to each other, because we're interacting on the basis of virtues and not really on the basis of values. There is a hierarchy, no doubt, but when we are in our power, in our spiritual consciousness, then we are not much concerned about hierarchy. We are concerned about our stage. We're concerned about our vibration, and we are detached from what other people are doing. We are in the midst of it, but it doesn't influence us. And if you remember, there was some phrases in the Murli today, in the first part of the Murli, where Baba was talking about the need to prepare oneself to return to the soul world by being in that high stage of soul consciousness, silence, deep stillness. When we are in this, that is a very, very uniting force, and we are drawn together, and we become the beads of the rosary by being in that stage, because we're in the same vibration, we're in the same frequency, we're in harmony. And so this connectedness with Shiv Baba is what creates that force of unity. And when we drop into body consciousness and we are grappling with the force of darkness, then that is the force of disunity, or the force of destruction. And in a way, that could be a consideration or a criteria for the difference between a golden-aged BK and a silver-aged BK. Because the silver-aged BK is the one who's always grappling with obstacles and the force of darkness and ego and all of this. It's a big struggle all the time. But for the one who is quietly focusing on their stage and wanting to be real, and that's the highest priority, to be in their power, to be close to Baba, and everything else is secondary, that is more of a golden age stage. So I think I've covered really the things I wanted to talk about, and let us now sit together for meditation, and I will say a few words. Turn the attention within. And allow yourself to become just pure consciousness. Go deep inside. I am light. Bodiless, genderless, cultureless, I am loving. At peace. Still. Detached. Silent. My mind flies to the One. And I connect. Point to Supreme Point. I am in the light. Absorbing light from the One. The energy flows into me and through me. I am with the One. The beautiful One. The Mother, Father of my being. Light to light. And the light intensifies. Passing through me, extending vastly. I am in the world of light. A conduit. Receiving, transmitting. Open and full as that love flows through. A great river of light and love, purity, coursing through my heart, reaching where it has to go. The soul stays in bliss. With the blissful one. Nothing else really matters. Just to be connected. And I descend to a subtle stage of consciousness. To act, to speak, to move around, still connected, still emitting And I connect again with this body, still connected with the divine. Om Shanti.